Hello, I'm Mark Eberhard, Director, Division of Parasitic Diseases in the Coordinating Center for Infectious Diseases at CDC. Today, we will be visiting and learning about the life and work of Dr. Bill Collins, a laboratorian who has spent his 50-year professional career with the U.S. government battling malaria. And, as you will see, at age 75, he is still going strong. With his experience, wit, and wisdom, Bill is continuing that fight because, in his own words, so much still needs to be done. To understand why Bill Collins has dedicated his career to malaria research, let me tell you about this ancient scourge that we have not yet brought under control. It causes suffering and death to millions each year throughout the world, the largest mortality in children under 5. Let me take a moment to give you some facts about malaria and the magnitude of this disease. Malaria is not new. It was recognized as a distinct disease in the Chinese literature dating back to 2700 BC. Malaria used to be common in the United States and caused considerable death and illness until it was eliminated in the late 1940s. Malaria remains firmly entrenched in the tropical and subtropical countries of the world, where poverty is a factor. The disease causes an estimated 5 billion episodes of illness each year. Malaria accounts for some 2.5 million deaths each year, ranking as one of the top 3 killer diseases worldwide. More than 75%, or almost 2 million of these deaths, are in children under 5 years of age. And 90% of malaria illness and death occurs in sub-Saharan Africa. Developed countries would not tolerate this tragic burden of disease and have eliminated it because it drains the energy and productivity of people. They could not endure this burden and continue to be economically strong. If we look at a map of malaria endemic countries and overlay it with a map of countries that have high poverty levels, we see they overlap, showing a very predictable pattern of malaria and poor economic development. These facts put into perspective the human suffering, the social losses, and economic costs brought on by malaria, a disease we can and must curtail. Bill Collins, a dedicated scientist, has devoted his professional life to that end, and as a father, grandfather, and humanitarian, admits that it is his goal to reduce that suffering and death for little children. That's what I'm going as long as he is able, long after others have retired. It is my pleasure, as a scientific colleague and friend who has worked with and admired Bill for many years, to introduce you to Dr. Bill Collins, the scientist, the federal employee, the humanitarian. Together, we can share his enthusiasm for the good work he does and learn about his remarkable life and work.
I started out as an entomologist, pure entomologist, classical entomology, 96 semester entomology. And then when I graduated, got my Ph.D. in entomology, I was drafted into the Army. It was during the Korean War era when everyone went into the Army. Well, not everyone. Some people didn't go in the Army, but I did. And I was assigned to a military base to do research, and there I was steered into a research on biomedical research. And there I moved into virus work, actually, doing virus work, infecting mosquitoes. And of course, logically, I drifted into infecting mosquitoes with viruses and what have you, and I got very interested in the biomedical aspects, but again, entomology. And but I went back to a university setting, and for some reason I was contacted by the Public Health Service, which asked me to join them, and I did go, then work for NIH, National Institutes of Health. And for some reason I got assigned to a group of malariologists. Now, I didn't know much, I didn't know anything actually about malariology, but entomologists fit very well in with the parasitologists. Malaria has always been associated with entomologists. And entomology is one of the basic cornerstones of the control of malaria. You control mosquitoes, you control malaria. And so after about 45 years, I've learned a little bit about malaria. The NIH had a number of field laboratories, and the field laboratory in this particular case was in South Carolina, at a mental hospital actually. The mental hospital at that particular time was treating mental patients with malaria. Now, this was the era, so to speak, of treating mental patients with malaria. The Nobel Prize had been granted back in the 1920s for the treatment of neurosyphilitic patients with malaria. It was before the advent of penicillin, and that a number of patients were benefited by so-called fever therapy or malaria. It was partially beneficial. It benefited maybe a third of the patients. Now, of course, with the advent of penicillin, it was not needed. Of course, penicillin helped, but in the era of the 20s and 30s, it did benefit about a third of the patients. And of course, it was dying, so to speak, as a treatment. And I went to this particular hospital because there were a few patients still being treated. The final so-called end of the treatment era of using malaria. Actually, I was only there for 4 years because that was the era of treatment, but I learned an awful lot about malaria at that particular time. Chloroquine-resistant falciparum malaria was isolated actually in one of the patients there in South Carolina in 1959. And this was a remarkable discovery because up to that time we thought that chloroquine was going to end up in, you know, eliminating falciparum malaria as a serious problem, that we could always use this drug, and this would really be the end of falciparum malaria, that we could always use chloroquine, and this was an awful discovery. Well, they decided that they were no longer going to treat mental patients with malaria. It was a, you know, penicillin was now effective. There was no need for that treatment. But there was in Atlanta a federal penitentiary in which volunteers were volunteering to test antimalarial drugs, and the NIH at that particular time had a program to treat the volunteers with different drugs to test new antimalarials, and they were being treated. At the same time, there was this program of infecting monkeys with malaria. Could it be possible that drugs could be tested in monkeys? We didn't have to use volunteers anymore. Would it be possible to do all the testing of drugs in monkeys? At the same time, just about the same time, some humans were being infected experimentally with monkey malaria. Was it possible then that people were being infected with monkey malaria? Was it happening in the wild? And so there was, out in Asia, actually in Malaysia, a laboratory was being set up to find out, were people in the wild, actually out in Malaysia, being accidentally infected with monkey malaria. So the National Institutes of Health set up a laboratory out in Malaysia to find out, was this occurring? So here in Chamblee, Georgia, a laboratory was set up with a bunch of monkeys, and people out in Malaysia were isolating monkey malaria and sending the parasites by air back to us here in Chamblee, and we were infecting monkeys back here. Then we would infect the monkeys here with those parasites. Actually, 5 brand new species of monkey malaria were isolated in Malaysia. They were sent back here to Chamblee. We would then infect mosquitoes, and volunteers at the federal prison down here would allow the mosquitoes to be fed on them to see if they could be transmitted to humans. It was really a thing to see, could it occur? And actually, several species of monkey malaria could be infected, could be infective to humans. Now, it turned out to be not a public health problem. It's a rare event. But we found out that it is a rare event and not a public health problem, and that was important to find out. But it allowed us, during the course of these studies, to find out that we could test drugs in monkeys, and that we no longer needed to use human volunteers. And so monkeys became very important to develop new antimalarial drugs. About the same time, down in South America, it was found out, actually in Panama, that human malarias could be used by infecting South American monkeys. Now we were able to do human malaria in New World monkeys, and we could do all sorts of studies. We no longer needed to even use humans for human malaria. So now we could use do all sorts of studies of human malaria in monkeys.
That opened the way for you to do all of your research then?
All research could be done on the campus here at CDC with human malarias. And so we could do all sorts of studies with drugs and vaccines directed against human malaria in non-human primates. The National Institutes of Health said, well, we're closing the prison project. It was not needed. And so CDC said, well, we want to have a research project in malaria here at CDC. And so in the middle of a job freeze, the director of CDC, under the urging of Dr. Robert Kaiser, said, we would like to establish a research facility on malaria here at CDC. So Dr. Kaiser, working with Dr. David Sensor, the director of CDC, was able to find some slots, so to speak, and hire me along with 4 of my technicians to establish a malaria research lab here in Chambly. So in 1974, we started a research lab for malaria here at Chambly. And we've been going now for 30 years. From that, it has grown tremendously. Now, fortunately, I never had to be head of any laboratory. You know, I've never been a chief. I never wanted to be a chief. We do research here on the thing, and it has grown. The malaria activities, research activities, have always been very active here at Chambly for the last 30 years, and we've done very, very well. During World War I, the Army camps were established in the South to train the soldiers during World War I, and 25% of the soldiers that were sent to the South to be trained during World War I came down with malaria. 25% of the soldiers that were sent to the South to be trained came down with malaria. Well, during World War II, it was determined that will not happen again. So they decided that malaria control in war areas was to control malaria around the training camps in the South. And it was extremely successful. The drainage, the spraying in that to protect our soldiers being trained in the South was extremely successful. It was so successful that at the end of World War II, they decided that they could extend that and so control malaria around all the southern states. And so at the end of World War II, under the urging of Williams, who was from NIH, it was decided that under the guidance that CDC would be founded to direct the guidance of eliminating malaria from the southeastern part of the United States, which is where malaria was, at that time, was concentrated. It would be a tremendous campaign, but it would be guided by CDC, but each of the states then would have the responsibility to control malaria. It would be a 4-year program, and it was primarily a program of eliminating the mosquito, the Anopheles quadrimaculata mosquito. And each of the states was then given the funds, but they had the responsibility to eliminate the mosquitoes by spraying every single rural building. That means each barn and each house, and each county, each municipality had to do it. CDC would give direction and guidance, and they would have the personnel to go around and determine that it was taken care of. Within 4 years, malaria was essentially eliminated. It was gone, but it took them another probably 10 years to prove it. Saying it's gone and proving it's gone is another thing. But in 4 years, it was essentially a completed project. So CDC began with a bunch of entomologists. And from that, we ended up with the great epidemiologic program that CDC has developed into now as a disease control agency, which covers every disease. It's really developed into not a malaria program, but a total disease program. But we still have a little smattering of malaria here that is recognized worldwide as an important malaria program, which is now expanded worldwide as expertise in malaria.
Tell us a little bit about your research program here at CDC.
Well, my job is to work on malaria, and it entails mosquitoes, malaria parasites, different malaria parasites, and in the present time, monkeys. We try and learn whatever we can the relationship between malaria parasites, mosquitoes, and the relationship to human malaria, primarily using monkeys as a surrogate for humans. There are many parasites that invade monkeys that are the same ones that invade humans, and then there are ones that invade monkeys that are very similar to humans. So if we determine the relationships between mosquitoes and malaria parasites in monkeys, we learn a lot about what happens when parasites and mosquitoes interact with humans.
What's a normal day like? What are your activities during the day?
Well, my day starts off generally with working with the mosquitoes, finding out what I did the day before and what I have to do with dissecting mosquitoes, determining what we're going to do with feeding mosquitoes on parasites that are invading our monkeys, and finding out what happened the day before, the week before, the month before, and generally writing up what has happened and determining what we're going to do next. We design vaccine trials. We plan ahead. Generally, we plan ahead months ahead of what has to be done. We have a lot of people asking us to provide them with parasites, provide them with advice on what to do, and we do a lot of studies with other agencies, other organizations and that, who come to CDC because we are a source of not only information but material.
People worry that malaria may be reintroduced into the United States. Is there a real chance of that happening?
We have some cases of malaria each year that are introduced by travelers coming back in the United States. Travelers, probably a couple thousand each year, come back to the United States. But we have a great surveillance system in this country. We have mosquito abatement districts in this country. But it's a surveillance system that keeps track of people coming into this country. And although we may have a few introduced cases, I think our surveillance system in this country is so good that I don't think there are any chance at all of epidemics of malaria in this country. We have maybe 4 or 5 cases of malaria every few years that might occur, but our surveillance system is so good, our mosquito abatement districts are so well equipped that chances of an epidemic of malaria or establishing malaria are essentially nil. We are too advanced for that sort of thing. Maybe I'm too confident, but I am confident. The great program to control malaria was actually established about 1916 in the United States. Frederick Hoffman put it forth in 1916. He was a great statistician with Prudential who decided that it could be done. They went to Congress and said, this is how it can be done. He laid out all the structure and how to do it. And they said, well, we just can't do that. It takes money and the infrastructure, and he laid it out. The organizations, the military, the public health to do it. But it wasn't until The NIH at the end of World War II said, you know, it can be done. We've done it with MCWA. We think we can do it. It took all that time for them to realize it can be done. We had the infrastructure. It takes infrastructure. It takes a lot of effort and organization, and it's a military almost operation to do that sort of thing. I don't think it's available in many countries and many organizations to do that sort of thing. In India, I think it took hundreds of thousands of people to set up their program for the malaria eradication. Now, they had a lot of people and they had an organization, they set it up. I'm not sure that many of the countries of Africa have that organization available, and it's going to take a while. Now, maybe they have, but I don't think so.
Bill, we were talking the other day about the three things that are needed to control and eradicate malaria: money, people, and commitment. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
You have to have money because you got to hire the people. You have to have money to buy the supplies, and commitment. Commitment not only by the people in charge, but commitment by the people in the villages, people all along the way. It takes time to get rid of malaria. Malaria is a stubborn beast. Well, malaria is a disease, not an organism. Someone says they have malaria, yes, they have a disease. But it really is a tough character. It's a tough disease. And sometimes, you know, if I put my money down, I'm not sure that the malaria parasite, malaria-causing parasite, sometimes I think I put my money on it instead of on the people who are fighting it. If they don't have the commitment, the parasite's going to hang in there.
Internationally, Bill, there was also a malaria eradication program. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the similarities to the program in the United States?
Well, the global eradication program was successful in many areas of the world and unsuccessful in others. In many parts of the world, it was a great success. For example, in many areas of the world, malaria was eradicated and has not come back. In other areas, it was successful but did come back. It has to be maintained. Some of the areas where it was not totally successful, for example, in Sri Lanka, where they brought it down, say, to 100 cases. But 100 cases is a seed, and it did come back. In India, which at one time had millions and millions and millions of cases of malaria, and they probably brought it down to maybe 100,000. And now it's up to, let's say, 4 to 6 million cases a year. But if they had 100 million cases a year before, that was a great success, but it was not eradication. Control is what was probably possible in some areas, and eventually they had to settle for control. Many people argued that it's not possible to eradicate malaria in some areas of the world. In some areas it was possible, and it was asking too much with the infrastructure that was available in some parts of the world. But it was never possible, or never even thought possible, in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. And I don't think people thought it could be done. But in many areas it was very successful. But the U.S. committed, I think, almost $1 billion to the eradication program. And some people thought that was well spent. Some people think it was not well spent. There was people on both sides. But it was before my era, so I'm not really acquainted with it that much. But I do know at the time many people said it was time to cut it off, because there came a time when they were spending too much money and they could not get that last effort done. But it did eliminate malaria from a lot of areas of the world, but it was unsuccessful in others.
Can you tell us a little bit about the eradication of malaria in the United States?
You know, if you spray and get rid of the mosquito, but there are problems. There are mosquitoes that feed outdoors only, and DDT does not work. But there are many areas of the world where DDT, even though it has a bad name in many areas of the world, is very, very effective if it used properly. But people who saturate the community with DDT, instead of using it just for public health, have problems. But where it's used for public health, it's extremely effective in preventing malaria.
Many people are concerned over the last few years about global warming. What implications do you see for malaria and controlling malaria related to global warming?
It's hard to say. You know, the mosquitoes are here. It may extend the season in which malaria could be involved. You know, frost or cold weather is what stops transmission, so extends the transmission season. But in an area like the United States, with our surveillance system and that sort of thing, malaria is not going to all of a sudden appear in the United States because of our surveillance system. So I don't think that's a problem, personally. In areas where they depend on the winter to kill off the mosquitoes, that may extend the time where malaria time of the year where malaria might be. But other than that, I don't think that it's a real concern. It's just something that I don't think is as far as spreading of malaria into new areas, with our surveillance systems, I don't think that's a real problem. Now, as far as extending it up the mountains and that sort of thing, it might. You know, we know that malaria only goes so far up hillsides because of the temperature, up to say 1,200 meters and that sort of thing. Well, if the world gets a little bit warmer, it may go up a little bit higher up the mountains, so malaria may go up a little bit higher and that sort of thing. But that is, I don't think, going to be a problem, for example, of it going up into Europe farther, because Europe and those other areas have surveillance systems just like we do. And I really am not really concerned about that. I think the malaria problem is in Africa. Malaria is in Southeast Asia, and I don't think the temperature thing is going to be our serious problem. Our serious problem is getting the infrastructure and control program in place and that sort of thing.
What's changed in the last 40 or 50 years in malaria research?
Well, I think it's the development of vaccine development and that sort of thing. Really that molecular development, development of methods of dissecting the parasite and finding out what pieces might be involved in producing an immune response to develop a vaccine. Now, drugs were the hot thing, so to speak, for the last, since chloroquine began to fail, they went into drugs. But drugs seem to last about every 5 years, and then the parasite develops resistance. And that's a problem, because you spend maybe $300 million developing a drug, and it lasts 5 years. That's a problem. Now we have a new, not a new, but an old Chinese drug called the artemisinin group. And they seem to have great promise. Problem is they're made of a plant. And so the plant drugs are generally difficult for the parasite to develop resistance to. But they have to be produced from a plant, like quinine. They're difficult for the parasite to develop resistance to. Now it's hoped that this can be synthesized, and if it's synthesized, then you have a problem. Almost all the synthesized drugs is the things that the parasite develops resistance to. But still, that might open up the drugs so that they will last a little bit longer. But we would like to have a vaccine. And there are some promising vaccines. Promising. This is the word I've heard for 20 to 25 years. Promising vaccines. But a vaccine that only works 20, 30% of the time is not what we need. We need a vaccine that works 95% of the time. We've been working on them for 30 years, and they still haven't got to the 90 to 95% of the time. And so we're really, really pressed for a vaccine. And we're testing these in our monkeys now. We hope to have a vaccine. But people get malaria 5 times a year for 20 years, which shows that having had an infection and you still don't get sterile immunity is not like having measles or yellow fever or something like that, where you get it and you have pretty good immunity. Malaria doesn't work that way. And so getting immunity against malaria is going to be tough, very, very tough. And so getting a vaccine against malaria is not like getting a vaccine against a virus such as yellow fever or something. It's more like getting a vaccine against a and getting a vaccine against a cold has been tough, and so, or against the flu. And so this, if we have to make a malaria vaccine, we have to make a new one each year, that's ridiculous. And so I think that we got a tough row to hoe when it comes for a malaria vaccine, and I hope we can do better than that.
Talking about malaria vaccines, tell us a little bit more about the approaches to making a vaccine and the different stages of the parasite that one might be trying to control or attack.
Well, we have several targets we're looking at. One is to stop the stage that the mosquito injects. That one has to be 100% effective, and there was a lot of promise for that. Unfortunately, the vaccine that was 99% effective wasn't effective at all, because it's 100% effective, and that's ran into a lot of roadblocks there, because we thought that had a great promise, but 99% effective wasn't good enough. The other one was the blood stage vaccine, and that has been worked on an awful lot. It keeps the infant or the child from dying, and that is a good vaccine. They still get sick, but they don't die, and that's a good vaccine. There's been a lot of work on that, and I think that has a lot of promise. The last vaccine is what we call the transmission blocking vaccine, which stops the mosquito from becoming infected. We have worked a lot on that, but basically the National Institute of Health has been working on that a lot recently. It doesn't help the patient, but it keeps the mosquito from transmitting within a village. And that's a good vaccine. If it could be included with other vaccines, we think that's a promise. All 3 of these are being worked on, but it's the last 2, the one that keeps the child from dying and the one that keeps mosquito from transmitting, which I think will really help us an awful lot. Those 2 vaccines, I think, will move along. Well, it's always thought that we would combine vaccines eventually, but each vaccine developer wants to work out a single vaccine by itself to prove it works. But eventual thought is you'd put all the pieces together and maybe even put them with a measles vaccine or a polio vaccine. Put all vaccines like to go as a combined vaccine. We would like to see a transmission vaccine that doesn't help an individual traveler or something with, say, a measles vaccine or a yellow fever vaccine, although most people don't take maybe yellow fever vaccine on their travels as much, but put it in with other vaccines, and combined vaccines is what you'd like to so-called sell, so that it benefits the whole population as much as you can. Insecticide-treated bed nets are the biggest thing on the market right now. Not necessarily on the market, they're being distributed free in many areas, but certainly they've made a tremendous impact. Bed nets have been around for over 100 years. Bed net where many of the mosquitoes like to bite at dusk or even in the nighttime while a person is sleeping. But in the last 10, 15 years, the treating of bed nets with an insecticide, where the mosquito is killed as it rests on the bed night or tries to probe on the patient, it's been a great innovation, and this has been fantastic. It has really cut down survival of the mosquito after it feeds or as it comes to feed. And this really has been tremendous. That combined with treating the walls inside the hut with an insecticide, and then if we had a transmission blocking vaccine, would really, really cut down malaria in a village. And you want to combine everything you can to control malaria. But the insecticide-treated bed nets has been a great innovation. And its distribution, whether you charge the people in the village or give them away free, is great, because the impact of malaria on the economy of an area where malaria is endemic is such that it's well worthwhile for an economy of a community or a country to distribute them free.
What's the connection between malaria, controlling malaria, and economic development in a country that has malaria?
Unfortunately, most of the deaths, particularly in Africa and places like that, are in children. So it's hard to economically say, well, you know, it's children that die and they don't have an impact on the economy. But the adults have morbidity. The workforce do have loss of work time, particularly in pregnant women who cannot work and men who have lost work time. But morbidity is a serious problem, and particularly in the work areas and that sort of thing. But the loss of work time for the women who do an awful lot of work in the tropical zones, after all, they do tend the fields and do a lot of work, much as the men do, and that sort of thing. But pregnant women have a terrible problem with malaria, particularly in their first pregnancy and that sort of thing. They have much severe malaria than they do in the second and third pregnancy. And so that, but the deaths are primarily in children. And so it's hard to measure economically the mortality, but the morbidity is terrible in the adults. But when you have 1 to 2 million deaths of children, that is unacceptable, totally unacceptable.
Bill, what do you see as the future of malaria research?
Well, I really don't think that the malaria parasite is rolled over yet and decided that it's done, because when I started working in 1959 on malaria, they said, you know, it's all over, quit training malariologists. I'm not sure the malaria parasite is rolled over yet. I think that it's going to be around a little bit longer, particularly in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and the Southwest Pacific. There are some nasty parasites out there that haven't given up yet. I think that vaccine work is a promising area. Drug work is a promising area. And I personally like biology. The relationships between parasites, mosquitoes, I just like biology. Now that's my personal opinion. If we look around, there are a lot of molecular people being trained, but very few parasitologists. Maybe there's not many entomologists either. I don't know. Maybe that's just my personal opinion, but when we look around, there's a lot of positions open for molecular biologists. But when we look around, there are few parasitologists. As people, in our laboratory here, there's very few real parasitologists around. There's a few of us entomologists, but there's some pretty sharp molecular people around, but they don't know what the parasite or the insect looks like. It's just my personal opinion.
Where are you from, Bill?
I come from Michigan and started collecting insects probably when I was 9 or 10, and always collected insects and spent the summer on a farm. And whether it's caterpillars or butterflies or beetles, I always was into insects and always I went to college, I was going to be an entomologist. Not that I knew what an entomologist really was going to do for a living. And so when I graduated from Michigan State and went on to Rutgers, I knew I was going to be an entomologist. And I didn't even know what I'd do for a living, but I was going to be an entomologist. Mainly because I liked insects. And I ran into a group of pretty good entomologists at Rutgers. Rutgers had a fine reputation for mosquitoes. After all, New Jersey Shore has a lot of mosquitoes. And there were some pretty good entomologists there. And I always kept going back to Rutgers until I went to work for Public Health Service. Never regretted going to the Public Health Service. I had a great admiration for the public health officers. The dedicated public health officers, particularly who were in the Science Corps. That doesn't knock the EIS officers, but I worked with the Science Corps. The malariologists, Martin Young, Jeff Jeffrey, and them, that were all malariologists. And I really have a great admiration for the people who spent their whole career as public health officers. Now, I was a civilian. I worked for the Public Health Service. And when I came to work for the Public Health Service, they said you have a choice. You can be an officer or a civilian. I'd been in the Army and I thought, gee, I think I'll be a civilian. But if I'd been an officer, they'd have thrown me out at the age of 64 or even younger, because after 33 years, they throw you out for some reason, which seems a terrible waste. But the officers are a committed group, and I have great admiration for them.
Bill, what's the future of malaria research? If you were starting out on a new career, what would you see as the areas that you would focus on?
I enjoy immensely what I do. I probably would have enjoyed anything involving insects. I've always enjoyed insects, and malaria is a good field. Now, viruses would have been a good field. I'm not sure I would like filaria, but but
there's mosquitoes involved.
The mosquitoes are involved there. But you know, insects have always fascinated me. But I do like the order of things. When you deal with insects, you have classification and order. And anything in biology, you're dealing with order. You know, the classification, and when you deal with biology, you're dealing with fascinating problems and order, trying to find out relationships and that sort of thing. And in biology, there's a tremendous amount of problems that you have to solve. And science is nothing but a series of problems you're trying to solve constantly. And I think that anyone that is in science or biology is faced with problems. And that's, you just follow the lead. And whatever you go in college, you follow the lead.
As you studied science, were your parents supportive? Were they scientists themselves? And did they find your career to be something that they were proud of?
Actually, he was in acting school in New York in 1939 when the war came along, and so he ended up in a defense factory and that sort of thing. So, but he supported me in everything I did. For some reason, I don't know why. Couldn't understand why I wanted to be an entomologist. And so here I am. 50 years with the government, yeah.
Bill, how did you meet your wife?
Well, I was working in a research lab for the Army, and my wife's a microbiologist, so I worked in a research facility where I had to take an immunization every 3 times a week for 3 years. So I met her. She was either giving me an immunization or bleeding me, so we got totally acquainted. So, so more or less the shot shop, so to speak. And so I met her at the research facility, and so we've been married 48 years, so I guess it's going to last. Yeah.
And you have children?
Yeah, I have 2 children, yes. They live here in the Atlanta area, so and 2 granddaughters, so everything works fine.
And any Scientist in the children or grandchildren?
Nary a one, as far as I can tell. Yeah, I wish they could become interested, because I could be glad to tell them all about bugs, but not a one.
What sort of other hobbies besides mosquitoes and malaria do you have?
Since I collected bugs, I also collect everything else. Anything I lay my hands on, I collect. And I collect stamps. I collect straight razors. I collect all sorts of junk. I collect straight razors. I'm looking at a man that doesn't shave, so hey, that's the way it goes.
Bill, are you ever going to retire?
No, my wife says she'd like me home once in a while to take her shopping, but other than that, no. I have a few more things to do, I think. There's always more things to do. You know, I came to work with the Public Health Service with a lot of things to do. If all the questions were answered, I'd go home. But there's still a few things to do. Now, many of the people that I worked with have retired. I don't know why. Some retired because of old age. Now, Bob Coatney, one of the men I came with, one of the finest malariologists, he died at 97. I mean, he had to retire. I mean, he was old. But some of the great public health service officers retired. Dr. Campbell, Ken Campbell, who was my boss for 15 or so years, retired. But he's moved on to another job, very important job. But he had something to do, and he retired to go on another job, and that's fine. If you have something to do, fine. But what I want to do is here. Now, if the CDC decided they want my office, to it, because I don't like my office. But if they don't want my office, I'll be glad to stay here.
What inspires you to continue on with your studies?
It's like a jigsaw puzzle with a lot of more pieces to be filled in. And we have a lot of pieces that are not done. I have 15 species of Plasmodium. Present time, I have 10 different species of mosquitoes that I'm raising. Now, there may be some more mosquitoes I would like to bring in. But 15 species of Plasmodium to play with. We have a number of different species of monkeys. And a lot of strains of malaria parasites coming in. And some are drug resistant, some are not. We have new vaccines that we'd like to test and that sort of thing. Hey, there's a lot to do yet. And you know, there's still 1.5 million to 2 million kids dying every year out there. Now, if all the questions were answered, those kids dying. I'd like to get that vaccine out there, maybe to get new drugs out there. Now, if it was all over, hey, I'd go home and collect the stamps. Haven't got all the stamps done either. So that's the way it is.